Hi, I'm Marcus. The day my in-laws demanded I sign over my house, my wife Sarah stood right beside them and nodded. She actually nodded, like giving away the home I'd worked 16-hour days to buy was just another Tuesday decision. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly buying properties around town for the past 8 years, including the very house they were sitting in when they made their demand. But what broke me wasn't their greed or even Sarah's betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the kitchen window as I stirred my coffee, watching the droplets race down the glass like tiny marathoners. It was barely 7 in the morning, but I'd been awake since 5:30, same as every day for the past 12 years. Old habits from construction work don't die easy, even when you don't swing a hammer anymore. The house was quiet, except for the coffee maker's gentle gurgle and Sarah's footsteps upstairs. She was getting ready for her shift at the dental office, probably picking out one of those colorful scrubs that made her look younger than her 34 years. I took a sip and let the warmth settle in my chest, thinking about the day ahead. 3 property inspections scheduled, 2 potential acquisitions to review, and a conference call with my accountant about the Henderson Street duplex I'd closed on last month. Not bad for a guy who started out mixing concrete at dawn and counting every dollar at dusk. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the dinner Sarah had cooked the night before, some Pinterest recipe with chicken and herbs that she'd been excited to try. She'd been different lately, lighter somehow, like she was carrying some secret that made her smile at random moments. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, a text from my property manager about a tenant issue at one of the rentals downtown. Nothing urgent, just a leaky faucet that needed attention. I made a mental note to call the plumber after breakfast and finished my coffee in comfortable silence. This was my favorite time of day, before the world demanded my attention, when I could just exist in the space I'd built with my own hands and decisions. The stairs creaked as Sarah came down, her hair still damp from the shower, pulling a cardigan over her shoulders. She moved with purpose, grabbing her purse from the counter and checking her phone in that quick, efficient way she'd perfected over years of managing Dr. Peterson's chaotic schedule. She was beautiful in the morning light, soft and natural, the way I'd fallen in love with her 9 years ago when she was working at the coffee shop near my first job site. "Morning, babe," she said, pecking my cheek while reaching for her travel mug. Her lips were cool and tasted like the mint toothpaste she always used. "Don't forget my parents are coming for dinner tonight." I nodded, though something in her tone made me pause. There was an edge there, subtle but present, like she was reminding me of something important, rather than just mentioning dinner plans. "What time should I expect them?" 6:30. "Mom's bringing her famous lasagna, and Dad wants to talk to you about something." She avoided my eyes when she said it, busying herself with adding cream to her coffee. "Something important." The word important hung in the air between us like smoke. In 9 years of marriage, Harold and Linda Morrison had never wanted to discuss anything important with me beyond asking when I planned to give them grandchildren, or why I didn't attend their church. They tolerated me because Sarah loved me, but I'd never been more than a necessary accessory to their daughter's happiness. The idea that Harold suddenly had something important to discuss felt like finding a snake in your garden when you were expecting roses. "Any idea what about?" I asked, keeping my voice casual while studying her face. Sarah had tells when she was nervous. She touched her earring, pressed her lips together just slightly, avoided direct eye contact. She was doing all 3. He didn't say exactly. She grabbed her keys from the hook by the garage door, movements quick and precise. "Probably just family stuff. You know how Dad gets with his ideas." I did know how Harold got with his ideas. He was the kind of man who believed his opinions were universal truths, and couldn't understand why everyone else didn't see the obvious wisdom in his suggestions. He'd spent the last 3 years dropping hints about how Sarah and I should move closer to them, maybe find a nice place in their neighborhood where the schools were better and the property values more stable. Never mind that we didn't have children, and our current house was in one of the most desirable areas in the city. After Sarah left for work, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the silence settle back around me. The house felt different somehow, like the air pressure had changed. I walked through the rooms I'd renovated with my own hands, touching the crown molding I'd installed in the dining room, checking the tile work in the downstairs bathroom that had taken me 3 weekends to perfect. Every nail, every board, every careful measurement represented hours of my life, sweat equity that had transformed this 1960s ranch into something beautiful and valuable. I'd bought the house 8 years ago, back when Sarah and I were still newlyweds figuring out what forever looked like. It was a foreclosure, neglected and sad, with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. Sarah had cried the first time I brought her to see it, and not happy tears. She'd stood in the living room with its water-stained ceiling and buckled hardwood floors, and asked if I was serious. But I could see past the damage to the bones of the place, the solid foundation and good proportions that just needed someone to care enough to fix what was broken. The renovation took 2 years of weekends and evenings, learning skills from YouTube videos and asking favors from guys I worked with who knew more about plumbing and electrical than I did. Sarah had been supportive in the beginning, bringing me sandwiches while I worked and picking out paint colors for the rooms I finished. But somewhere along the way, her enthusiasm had faded into resignation, and eventually into something that looked almost like resentment when she thought I wasn't watching. By 10 o'clock, I was driving across town to look at a potential investment property in the Riverside district. The neighborhood was transitioning, old industrial buildings being converted into lofts and artisan workshops, young families moving into renovated bungalows that 5 years ago nobody wanted. I'd learned to spot these shifts early, to see opportunity where others saw only problems. It was a skill that had served me well in construction, and even better in real estate. The property was a duplex built in the 1940s, solid brick construction with good bones but cosmetic issues that scared off most buyers. The elderly owner wanted to sell quickly, needed the money for his wife's medical bills, and was willing to negotiate on price for a cash offer. I walked through both units, making notes on my phone about necessary repairs and potential rental income. The numbers worked, barely, but in 2 years when the neighborhood fully gentrified, the property would be worth 50% more than what I'd pay today. This was how I'd built my portfolio over the past 8 years, one careful acquisition at a time. While Sarah thought I was just working construction and putting money in our joint savings account, I'd been studying the market, learning about financing options, building relationships with wholesalers and property managers who could help me scale beyond what my day job income would normally allow. It wasn't deception exactly, more like strategic privacy. Sarah worried about money, always had, and I didn't want her losing sleep over leveraged investments and calculated risks that she wouldn't understand. My phone rang as I was measuring the kitchen in the second unit. Sarah's contact photo filled the screen, a picture I'd taken of her laughing at something during our vacation to the mountains last spring. She looked carefree and young, the way she used to look all the time before life got complicated. "Hey babe," I answered, tucking the phone between my ear and shoulder while I finished writing down the dimensions of the living room. "Are you busy?" Her voice sounded strange, higher pitched than normal, like she was forcing cheerfulness. "I just wanted to make sure you remembered about dinner tonight. My parents are really looking forward to it." Of course I remembered. 6:30 right. I capped my pen and slipped it into my shirt pocket. "Everything okay? You sound different." "I'm fine, just busy here. Dr. Peterson has been in a mood all morning, and we're booked solid until 5. She paused and I could hear the muffled sounds of the dental office in the background, phones ringing and the high whine of equipment. "Marcus, whatever my dad wants to talk about tonight, just hear him out, okay? He means well." There it was again, that careful tone that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "Sarah, what's going on? You're acting like your father is about to ask me to donate a kidney." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Don't be dramatic, it's probably nothing. I just want tonight to go smoothly." After we hung up, I sat in my truck outside the duplex for a few minutes, watching a crew of city workers repair a broken water main across the street. Sarah's behavior was bothering me more than I wanted to admit. In 9 years together, she'd never been good at keeping secrets, especially not from me. Her face was like an open book when she was hiding something, and this morning she'd looked like she was trying to hide an entire library. I drove home through the lunch rush, taking the long way that went past 3 of my rental properties. Everything looked good from the street, lawns maintained, no obvious issues that would require immediate attention. I'd been lucky with tenants so far, mostly young professionals who paid on time and didn't cause problems. The rental income had grown to the point where it almost matched what I made from construction work, which opened up possibilities I was still exploring. At home I spent the afternoon doing the kind of domestic maintenance that kept our house running smoothly, cleaned out the gutters, checked the furnace filter, tightened a loose handle on the kitchen cabinet that had been wobbling for weeks. Physical work had always calmed my mind, gave me space to think through problems without the distraction of conversation or entertainment. Today though, my thoughts kept circling back to Sarah's nervous energy, and Harold's mysterious important topic. By 5:30, I'd showered and changed into the kind of casual but nice clothes that Sarah's parents expected when they visited. Khakis instead of jeans, a button-down shirt instead of a t-shirt, the uniform of respectability that Harold appreciated even if he'd never say so directly. I was setting the dining room table when I heard Sarah's car in the driveway, followed immediately by the sound of her parents' silver Buick pulling up behind her. Through the front window, I watched the three of them walking up the sidewalk together, Linda carrying a covered dish and Harold with what looked like a folder or envelope under his arm. They were talking among themselves, heads close together in the way people do when they're sharing secrets or making final plans. Sarah kept glancing toward the house like she was checking to see if I was watching, which of course I was. "Marcus," Linda called out as they came through the front door, her voice bright and artificial in the way it always was when she was trying too hard to seem happy.
"How are you, dear? You look wonderful."
Linda Morrison was the kind of woman who had perfected the art of saying nice things while somehow making them sound like criticisms. She hugged me with the enthusiasm of someone embracing a distant relative at a funeral, patting my back twice before stepping away. Her perfume was overpowering, floral and cloying, the same scent she'd worn to every family gathering for the past 9 years. Harold's handshake was firm but brief, his pale blue eyes studying my face like he was looking for signs of weakness or deception. He was shorter than me by several inches but carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd spent 40 years selling insurance and believing that made him an expert on risk assessment. His gray hair was perfectly combed, his golf shirt pressed and tucked into pants that probably cost more than I used to make in a week. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying that false heartiness that men of his generation used when they were about to discuss business. "Good to see you. House looks great as always. You've really done something special with this place." The compliment felt loaded, like it was leading somewhere I probably didn't want to go. "Thanks, Harold. It's been a labor of love." Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, reheating Linda's lasagna, and preparing a salad while the three of us made small talk in the living room. The conversation felt stilted, full of pauses and careful pleasantries that didn't quite hide the underlying tension. Linda asked about my work, Harold mentioned something about the weather, and I found myself giving shorter and shorter answers as the evening progressed. Dinner was Linda's standard performance, every bite accompanied by detailed explanations of her cooking process and subtle suggestions for how Sarah might improve her own culinary skills.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lasagna was good, I had to admit, layers of cheese and meat sauce that probably took her most of the day to prepare, but even complimenting her cooking felt like walking through a minefield where saying the wrong thing or showing too much enthusiasm might somehow be turned against me later. Sarah barely ate, pushing food around on her plate while casting nervous glances between her parents and me. Every few minutes Harold would clear his throat like he was about to say something important, then take another bite instead. The anticipation was becoming unbearable, like waiting for a dentist to start drilling. Finally, after Linda had exhausted her repertoire of neighborhood gossip and Harold had finished his second helping of lasagna, the moment arrived. Harold set down his fork, reached for the folder he'd brought, and looked directly at me with the expression of a man about to deliver a verdict. "Marcus," he began, his voice taking on the formal tone he probably used when explaining insurance policies to reluctant customers. "Linda and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about family, about the future, about what's best for everyone involved." I nodded politely, though my stomach was beginning to tighten with apprehension. Sarah had gone completely still beside me, her hands folded in her lap like a child waiting to find out if she was in trouble. "We're not getting any younger," Linda added, dabbing at the corners of her mouth with her napkin. "And we've realized that we need to start making some practical decisions about our living situation, about how we can all support each other better." Harold opened the folder and pulled out what looked like legal documents, several pages of text that had been printed on expensive paper with official-looking letterhead. "The thing is, son, we've been struggling a bit financially. Medical bills, property taxes, the usual challenges that come with retirement. Nothing catastrophic, you understand, but enough to make us reconsider our long-term plans." I glanced at Sarah looking for some clue about where this conversation was heading, but she was staring at her plate like it held the secrets of the universe. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "Is there something we can do to help?" "Actually, there is." Harold's smile was practiced and cold, the expression of a salesman about to close a deal. "We've been talking to a financial advisor, someone who specializes in family wealth management, and he's helped us come up with a solution that could benefit everyone."
He spread the documents on the table between us, pages covered with legal language and highlighted sections that looked like they'd been prepared specifically for this moment. The idea is fairly simple. We consolidate our resources, pool our equity, create a stronger financial foundation for the entire family. Linda leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm that felt forced and uncomfortable. It's really quite brilliant when you think about it. Instead of 3 separate households struggling with individual mortgages and expenses, we create one strong financial unit that can weather any storm. I looked down at the papers, trying to make sense of the legal terminology while Harold continued his pitch. What we're proposing is that you transfer ownership of this house to a family trust that we'd establish. In return, you and Sarah would have guaranteed housing for life, no mortgage payments, no property tax worries, complete security. The words hit me like cold water: transfer ownership, family trust, guaranteed housing for life. Each phrase was carefully chosen, designed to make theft sound like generosity, to frame giving away my home as some kind of favor they were doing for me. The beauty of the arrangement, Harold continued, apparently oblivious to my shock, is that it protects everyone's interests. You get financial security, we get the resources we need to maintain our retirement. Sarah gets the peace of mind that comes from knowing her family is taken care of. I looked at Sarah again, searching her face for some sign that she was as horrified by this proposal as I was. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop to my shoes. She was nodding, not enthusiastically, not with joy, but with the resigned acceptance of someone who had already agreed to something she wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Sarah," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you know about this?" She finally looked at me, and I could see guilt written across her features like a confession. "We've talked about it," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "It makes sense when you really think about it, Marcus. We'd have no mortgage, no maintenance costs, no property taxes. We could use that money for other things, maybe travel, maybe start a family." Harold was nodding along, pleased with his daughter's support. "Sarah understands the bigger picture here. This isn't about taking anything away from you, son. It's about creating something stronger together." I stared at the documents, at the highlighted sections that would legally transfer the house I'd bought and renovated and loved into their control. The house where I'd learned to install tile and wire electrical outlets and fix leaky pipes. The house where Sarah and I had made love for the first time as married people, where we'd hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties and quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper in bed. "And if we say no?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Harold's expression hardened slightly, the mask of forced friendliness slipping just enough to show the steel underneath. "Well, that would be unfortunate. Linda and I had hoped we could handle this as a family, keep everything private and amicable. But if that's not possible, we might have to explore other options." "What other options?" Linda's voice was soft but firm when she answered. "Marcus, dear, you have to understand our position. We've supported Sarah through some very difficult times, helped her in ways that maybe you don't fully appreciate. If we can't find a way to work together on this, we might have to ask her to choose between her family and other loyalties." The threat was delivered with such practiced sweetness that it took me a moment to fully process what she was saying. Choose between her family and other loyalties, meaning me, meaning our marriage. They were essentially telling me to sign over my house, or they'd pressure Sarah to leave me. I looked at Sarah again, hoping to see outrage or shock or some sign that she was as appalled by her parents' ultimatum as I was. Instead, I saw resignation. She'd known this was coming, she'd agreed to it. She'd brought them into our home knowing they were going to demand I give up everything I'd worked for, and she'd said yes. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Harold gathered up the papers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Of course, these are big decisions, life-changing decisions. Take the time you need, but Marcus, I hope you'll consider what's really important here: family loyalty, security, the chance to be part of something bigger than just your individual interests." After they left, after the dishes were cleared, and the kitchen cleaned, and the house returned to its normal quiet state, Sarah and I stood facing each other in the living room like strangers. The air between us felt charged with unspoken accusations and broken trust. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her look smaller and younger. "It's not what you think. They're really struggling, Marcus. Dad's insurance business has been slow, and Mom's medical bills from last year's surgery are more than they expected. They're not trying to hurt us. They're asking me to give them my house, Sarah. The house I bought, that I renovated, that I pay the mortgage on. How is that not hurting us? It would still be ours. We'd still live here. We just wouldn't have the financial burden anymore. Her voice was getting higher, defensive and strained. And it's not just your house, Marcus. It's our house. We're married. We're supposed to make decisions together. The casual way she said it, like my years of work and investment were just details to be overlooked, hit me harder than her parents' threats had. Did you sign something? Are you legally committed to this already? No, of course not, but I told them we'd consider it seriously. They're my parents, Marcus. They raised me, they supported me through college, they've been there for every important moment of my life. I can't just abandon them when they need help. I walked to the window, looking out at the street I'd grown to love, at the neighborhood where I'd planned to raise children, and grow old with the woman I'd married. And what about me? What about what I need? This could be good for us too. No mortgage payments means we could save money, maybe take that trip to Europe we've been talking about. Maybe finally start trying for a baby without worrying about the extra expenses. Every word she spoke felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. She'd discussed our future with her parents, made plans that involved giving away my life's work, and somehow convinced herself that this was all for our benefit. The woman I'd fallen in love with, who used to bring me sandwiches while I worked on renovations and told me how proud she was of what we were building together, had disappeared sometime over the past few months, and been replaced by this stranger who saw my home as an asset to be traded away. I'm going for a drive, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. Marcus, wait, can't we talk about this? Can't we at least discuss it like adults? I stopped at the door, my hand on the knob, and turned back to look at her one more time. Sarah, they threatened to make you choose between them and me, and you brought them here anyway. What exactly is there left to discuss? I drove through the city without any particular destination, past the rental properties I owned, and the construction sites where I'd learned my trade, and the coffee shop where I'd first met Sarah 9 years ago. The streets looked different in the darkness, unfamiliar, and somehow hostile, like I was seeing them through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged. Eventually, I found myself parked outside the duplex I'd looked at that morning, sitting in my truck and staring at the building that represented everything I'd learned about recognizing value where others saw only problems. The elderly owner wanted to sell quickly, needed cash for his wife's medical bills, was willing to negotiate on price. Just like Harold and Linda, people in crisis often made desperate decisions that they might regret later. But there was a difference between helping someone in genuine need and being manipulated by people who saw your kindness as weakness. Harold and Linda weren't facing eviction or bankruptcy, they were facing the normal challenges of retirement and had decided that their son-in-law's life's work was the solution to their problems. They'd enlisted their own daughter in a scheme to pressure me into giving up everything I'd built, and they'd done it with the cold calculation of people who believed they deserved whatever they could take. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for James Rodriguez, the real estate attorney who'd helped me with several property acquisitions over the years. He was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my investment portfolio, who understood that the quiet construction worker that everyone saw was actually a man who owned more property than most people twice his age. James, I said when he answered, it's Marcus Thompson. I know it's late, but I need some advice about asset protection. Marcus, good to hear from you. Asset protection? What kind of situation are we talking about? I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts before speaking. Hypothetically, if someone was pressuring me to transfer ownership of my primary residence, what would be the best way to protect my other investments? That depends on the nature of the pressure and the legal structure of your current holdings. Are we talking about divorce proceedings, business disputes, or something else? Family pressure? In-laws who think they're entitled to my property because of financial difficulties? James was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications. Marcus, family disputes over property can get very complicated very quickly. Have you considered that your wife might have legal claims to some of your assets regardless of whose name is on the deed? It was a sobering thought, one that I'd been avoiding all evening. What kind of claims? Well, depending on how your properties were acquired and what marital assets were used in the purchases, she might be entitled to a significant portion of your portfolio in a divorce proceeding. Community property laws can be tricky, especially when one spouse hasn't been fully transparent about the extent of their holdings. The word transparent stung because I knew he was right. I'd been so focused on building my portfolio and protecting Sarah from financial stress that I'd never fully disclosed the scope of my investments. She knew I owned some rental properties, but she had no idea that my real estate holdings were worth more than most people's retirement accounts. "I need to see you tomorrow," I said. "Can you fit me in?" "Of course. First thing in the morning, Marcus. Whatever's going on, don't make any hasty decisions. Family situations like this can usually be resolved with the right approach and proper legal protection." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness for another hour thinking about the conversation with Harold and Linda, about Sarah's betrayal, about the careful plans they'd made without considering what I might want or need. They'd assumed I would roll over and accept their demands because that's what I'd always done before. Be quiet, be grateful, don't cause problems, accept whatever role they assigned me in their family drama, but they'd made one critical miscalculation. They thought they knew who they were dealing with, thought they understood the extent of my resources and my options. They saw a construction worker who'd gotten lucky with one house, a man who should be grateful for their daughter's love and willing to pay any price to keep it. What they didn't know was that the quiet construction worker owned 8 rental properties across the city, including the house where Harold and Linda lived. They didn't know that I'd been their landlord for the past 3 years, collecting rent through a property management company while they complained about their rising living costs and financial difficulties. They didn't know that their financial struggles were partially my responsibility because I'd been gradually raising their rent to market rates after years of keeping it artificially low out of family loyalty. Most importantly, they didn't know that I'd been documenting everything. Every conversation, every veiled threat, every attempt to manipulate Sarah into pressuring me. I had recordings on my phone, copies of the legal documents they'd brought, evidence of their systematic campaign to take ownership of my home. As I drove back toward the house that might not be mine much longer, I thought about the lesson I'd learned from years of buying distressed properties and turning them profitable. Sometimes the best investment strategy wasn't to fight for what seemed valuable on the surface. Sometimes it was better to let people reveal their true nature, to give them enough rope to hang themselves, and then position yourself to benefit from their mistakes. Harold and Linda wanted to play hardball, wanted to use family loyalty and emotional manipulation to take what they thought they deserved. Sarah wanted to choose her parents' security over our partnership, wanted me to sacrifice my life's work for the sake of keeping peace in her family. They were all about to learn something important about ownership, about loyalty, and about what happened when you mistook kindness for weakness. But I wasn't going to fight them directly, wasn't going to engage in the kind of emotional warfare they were prepared for. Instead, I was going to let them have exactly what they thought they wanted, and then I was going to show them what real consequences looked like. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, Sarah already asleep, or pretending to be. I sat in my truck for a few more minutes, looking at the home I'd built with my own hands, memorizing the details of the front porch I'd restored, and the landscaping I'd planned and installed. Tomorrow, everything would start to change. Tonight was the last time I'd see this place as an innocent man who still believed his wife was on his side. I walked through the front door quietly, not wanting to wake Sarah or start another conversation that would only lead to more lies and justifications. The house felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what had been planned within its walls. Every room held memories of the life I'd thought we were building together, but those memories felt hollow now, like photographs of places that had never really existed. In the bedroom, Sarah was curled on her side of the bed, breathing deeply in what might have been real sleep or careful pretense. I undressed quietly and slipped under the covers, lying on my back and staring at the ceiling I'd painted 3 years ago during a weekend when Sarah had been visiting her parents. Tomorrow, I would call James Rodriguez and begin the process of protecting my assets and my future. Tomorrow, I would start implementing the plan that had been forming in my mind during the drive home. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching Harold and Linda Morrison that some lessons come with a price they never expected to pay. But tonight, I lay in the darkness next to my wife and tried to remember what it felt like to trust the person sleeping beside you. Tried to recall the feeling of believing that the woman you loved would choose you over anything else in the world. Tried to hold on to the last few hours of being the man I used to be, before I became someone who understood that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most willing to betray you. Outside, the autumn rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in the spring. Inside, I closed my eyes and began the process of letting go of everything I'd thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the meaning of home. The morning light filtered through the blinds in James Rodriguez's office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where my life was about to change direction. I'd been awake since 4:30, my mind racing through possibilities and contingencies, preparing for a conversation that would either protect everything I'd built or expose me to losses I wasn't ready to face. James sat across from me, reading through the documents Harold had left behind, occasionally making notes in the margins with a gold pen that caught the light when he moved. "This is more sophisticated than I expected," he said finally, setting down the papers and leaning back in his leather chair. "Your father-in-law has clearly consulted with someone who knows estate planning law. The family trust structure he's proposing isn't inherently fraudulent, but the way he's presenting it raises several red flags." I shifted in my seat, the morning coffee I'd grabbed on the way over sitting like acid in my stomach. What kind of red flags? The timeline for one thing. Creating a family trust for asset protection is typically a long-term strategy, something you plan years in advance. The fact that he's presenting this as an immediate solution to their financial problems suggests they're either desperate or opportunistic. James picked up another document, scanning the fine print. "Also, the beneficiary structure heavily favors his interests over yours. You'd be giving up ownership in exchange for what amounts to 10, meaning they could evict me from my own house. Under certain circumstances, yes. The trust provisions include clauses about family harmonies and beneficial use that are vague enough to be interpreted however the trustees see fit." He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began sketching a diagram. "Marcus, before we go any further, I need to understand the full scope of what we're protecting. You mentioned other properties on the phone last night." I took a deep breath, knowing that once I shared this information, there would be no going back to the simple narrative that everyone in my family believed about my financial situation. "I own 8 rental properties in addition to my primary residence. Total value is approximately $2.4 million, with about $600,000 in equity after mortgages." James's pen stopped moving across the paper. He looked up at me with the expression of someone who just realized he'd been playing checkers while his opponent was playing chess. 8 properties. Marcus, does your wife know about this?" "She knows about 2 of them, maybe 3. I've been keeping the business separate from our personal finances to avoid stressing her out about the risks involved." Even as I said it, I could hear how weak the justification sounded. I always planned to tell her everything eventually.
Eventually just became now.
James set down his pen and leaned forward. "This changes everything about your situation. If your in-laws are genuinely struggling financially and they discover the extent of your holdings, this could escalate beyond family pressure into something much more serious." "What do you mean?" "I mean legal challenges to your marriage's financial transparency, possible claims that you've been hiding marital assets, even accusations of fraud depending on how aggressive they want to get." He pulled out another file folder. "The good news is that we can protect you, but it's going to require some strategic moves that might temporarily make your family situation worse before it gets better." Over the next 2 hours, James walked me through a comprehensive asset protection strategy that felt like preparing for war. We discussed limited liability companies, property transfers, spousal consent requirements, and documentation that would need to be gathered to prove the timeline of my acquisitions. Every option came with risks and benefits that had to be weighed against unknown variables about how far Harold and Linda were willing to push their demands. "The nuclear option," James said, pulling out a thick legal document, "is full disclosure followed by aggressive protection. We file paperwork to transfer all your properties into an LLC structure, then present your wife and her parents with a complete accounting of your assets along with legal notice that any attempts to pressure you into property transfers will be considered coercion. And the subtle option, we quietly protect what we can, document everything they're doing, and wait to see how far they're willing to escalate before we respond." He slid another document across the desk. But Marcus, you need to understand that once they discover what you actually own, this is going to become a very different kind of conflict. I thought about Sarah sleeping beside me the night before, about the years we'd spent building what I thought was a partnership based on trust and mutual support. What if I just gave them what they're asking for, transferred the house, took the loss, started over somewhere else? James's expression was the kind lawyers reserve for clients who are about to make catastrophically stupid decisions. You'd be setting a precedent that your assets are available to anyone with a sob story and enough emotional leverage. Plus, given the structure of the trust they're proposing, you'd likely lose the house completely within 2 years when they decide they need to liquidate assets for their retirement. So my choices are fight or surrender everything. Your choices are fight smart or fight stupid. The difference is whether you control the timing in terms of the confrontation. He gathered up the documents and slid them into a folder with my name on it. I'm recommending the aggressive protection strategy. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it gives you the best chance of keeping both your assets and your marriage. I left James's office with a briefcase full of legal documents and a timeline that would put everything in motion within 48 hours. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that usually made me optimistic about possibilities and new beginnings. Today it felt like the calm before a storm that would reshape the landscape of my entire life. My first stop was the property management company that handled my rental portfolio. Karen Hendricks had been managing my properties for 5 years, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who treated rental real estate like a military operation. Her office was in a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of efficient, unglamorous space that serious business people preferred over flashy corporate towers. Marcus, she said, standing up from behind a desk covered with property reports and maintenance requests. Good to see you. I was just reviewing the quarterly reports for your units. Everything's running smoothly, occupancy at 97%, maintenance costs within budget.
That's good to hear. I settled into the chair across from her desk, trying to organize my thoughts into a coherent explanation. Karen, I need to ask you about one of the properties specifically. The house on Maple Street where the Morrisons live. Her fingers moved across her keyboard, pulling up the file. Harold and Linda Morrison, Unit 412 Maple Street. They've been model tenants for 3 years, always pay on time, no maintenance issues. Rent is currently $850 a month, which is about $200 below market rate. Are you thinking about bringing it up to current levels? The irony was almost overwhelming. Harold and Linda had been living in my house for 3 years, paying rent that was subsidized by my generosity, while complaining about their financial struggles and planning to pressure me into giving them my primary residence. They'd been taking advantage of my kindness while simultaneously plotting to take advantage of my marriage. I want to review their lease terms, I said. Specifically, what are the provisions for rent increases and lease termination? Karen's expression shifted slightly, the way it did when she sensed that a property owner was about to make a decision that might complicate her job. They're on a month-to-month lease now, has been for the past year since their original lease expired. Standard 30-day notice for any changes. Is there a problem I should know about? Not a problem exactly, more like a conflict of interest that I just discovered. I explained the family situation in general terms, leaving out the specific details about the trust scheme but making it clear that our landlord-tenant relationship had become complicated by personal factors. Jesus, Marcus. They don't know you're their landlord. Karen leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. How is that even possible? I've always kept my rental business separate from my personal life. The property management agreement lists you as the primary contact and all the paperwork goes through your office. As far as they know, they're renting from some anonymous investor who owns properties around the city. And now they're trying to pressure you into giving them your house. She pulled up another screen on her computer. This is like something out of a soap opera. What do you want to do about it? I thought about the legal documents in my briefcase, about James's advice regarding aggressive protection strategies, about the expression on Sarah's face when she'd nodded along with her parents' demands. I want to bring their rent up to market rate, effective next month. And I want to be prepared to terminate their lease if this family situation gets any worse. Karen nodded, making notes in their file. Market rate for that property is about $1,200 a month now, so we're talking about a $350 increase. That's substantial enough that they'll probably want to negotiate or look for alternative housing. Let them look, I said, surprised by the hardness in my own voice. They've been getting a discount on their rent for 3 years because I thought we were family.
If they want to treat me like a mark instead of a son-in-law, they can pay market rates like everyone else. After leaving the property management office, I drove through the city with no particular destination, just needing time to think and process the morning's revelations. The streets looked different somehow, like I was seeing them through the eyes of someone who'd just learned that his life was built on foundations that were shifting beneath him. Every familiar landmark reminded me of a time when things seemed simpler, when I believed that working hard and treating people fairly would be enough to build a secure and happy life. I found myself parked outside the duplex I'd looked at the day before, the property that represented everything I'd learned about recognizing opportunity in unexpected places. The elderly owner had left a note taped to the front door, probably responding to my inquiry about a cash purchase. I got out of the truck and walked up to read it, grateful for any distraction from the turmoil of family politics and legal strategies. Mr. Thompson, the note read in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for your interest in our property. We've decided to accept your offer if you're still interested. Please call at your earliest convenience. Agnes Pemberton." I stood there holding the note, thinking about the timing of everything that was happening in my life. Yesterday, I'd been a construction worker with a modest real estate portfolio and a marriage that seemed stable despite its imperfections. Today I was preparing for legal warfare with my in-laws while acquiring my 9th rental property from an elderly woman who needed cash for her husband's medical bills. The parallels weren't lost on me. Agnes Pemberton was facing genuine financial hardship and making difficult decisions about assets she'd probably planned to keep for the rest of her life. Harold and Linda Morrison were facing normal retirement challenges and had decided that their son-in-law's assets were the solution to their problems. Both situations involved older people dealing with money pressures, but the difference in their approaches said everything about character and integrity. I called Agnes from my truck, arranging to meet that afternoon to finalize the purchase. She sounded relieved and grateful, the way people do when a burden they've been carrying is finally lifted from their shoulders. The transaction would be straightforward, honest and mutually beneficial. Both parties would get what they needed without anyone being manipulated or coerced into giving up more than they could afford to lose. As I drove toward home, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with Sarah when she got back from work. James had been clear that successful asset protection required full disclosure to my spouse, which meant revealing the extent of my property holdings and explaining why I'd kept them private. It also meant confronting her about her parents' scheme and making it clear that I wasn't going to be pressured into giving up what I'd worked to build. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, tainted by the knowledge of what had been planned within its walls. I moved through the rooms I'd renovated, touching surfaces I'd installed and fixtures I'd chosen, trying to reconnect with the satisfaction I used to feel when I looked at what I'd accomplished. Instead, everything felt temporary and uncertain, like I was visiting a museum of someone else's life. I spent the afternoon organizing documents and preparing for the conversation that would either save my marriage or end it. Bank statements showing property acquisitions, rental income records, correspondence with property managers, tax returns that revealed an income substantially higher than what Sarah believed I earned. The paper trail told the story of a man who'd been building wealth steadily and strategically while his wife thought he was just getting by on construction wages. By 5 o'clock, I had everything arranged on the dining room table where Harold had spread his trust documents the night before. The symbolism wasn't accidental. He'd used this space to present his demands for my property. I was going to use the same space to show Sarah exactly what those demands would cost us and why her parents' financial problems weren't something we were obligated to solve. Sarah's car pulled into the driveway at 5:45, right on schedule. Through the window, I watched her gathering her purse and work bag, moving with the tired efficiency of someone who'd spent 8 hours managing other people's problems. She looked young and vulnerable in the evening light, and for a moment I felt a flash of the protective affection that had defined our relationship for so many years. Then I remembered her nodding along with her parents' plan to take my house, and the affection hardened into something colder and more determined. "Hey," she said, coming through the door with a cautious smile, "you're home early. How was your day?" "Productive," I said, gesturing toward the dining room table. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered when she saw the documents spread across the table. "Marcus, what is all this?" "It's the truth about our financial situation. The truth you should have known before you agreed to let your parents steal my house." I pulled out a chair for her, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "Sit down, Sarah. It's time you learned who you're really married to." She moved toward the table slowly, her eyes scanning the papers with growing confusion and what might have been recognition. These are bank statements, property deeds. Marcus, I don't understand. That's the problem, I said, sitting across from her in the same chair where Harold had delivered his ultimatum. You don't understand, because I haven't been completely honest with you about the scope of my investments. And your parents don't understand, because they think they're dealing with someone who has no options. I walked her through the documents systematically, explaining each property acquisition and the rental income it generated. Her face went through a series of expressions as the reality of our actual financial situation became clear. Confusion gave way to shock, shock to something that looked like betrayal, and finally to an anger that matched my own. You've been lying to me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For years you've been lying to me about how much money we have. I've been protecting you from financial stress and market risks that you wouldn't have understood. The justification sounded weak even to me, but I pushed ahead. I planned to tell you everything when the portfolio was stable enough that we could live off the rental income permanently. When were you planning to tell me? When we were 60, when I was too old to have a say in how we managed our lives. She picked up one of the property deeds, staring at the legal description of a house she'd never seen. How much are we worth, Marcus? About $2.4 million in real estate equity plus our savings and retirement accounts. The number hit her like a physical blow. She actually recoiled, her hand going to her throat in a gesture of shock that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. $2.4 million, and you let me worry about whether we could afford to replace the dishwasher. I wanted you to feel secure without feeling burdened by the responsibilities that come with significant assets. Even as I said it, I knew how condescending it sounded. Real estate investment involves risks and complications that would have stressed you out unnecessarily. That wasn't your decision to make. Her voice was rising now, years of frustration and confusion finally finding an outlet. I'm your wife, Marcus, your partner. You don't get to decide what I can handle or what I need to know about our lives. She was right, and I knew it. But her righteousness was undermined by the fact that she'd agreed to help her parents steal what she thought was my only significant asset. You're talking about partnership and honesty. Yesterday you brought your parents here to pressure me into giving up my house. You knew they were going to threaten our marriage if I didn't comply, and you said nothing. That's completely different. They're struggling financially, and they needed help. I thought we could find a way to support them without sacrificing our security. By giving them my house, by letting them threaten to destroy our marriage if I didn't comply. I pulled out the trust documents Harold had left behind. Did you read these carefully, Sarah? Do you understand what your parents were actually asking for? She took the papers with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the legal language that she probably didn't fully comprehend. They said it would protect us from financial liability while helping them with their retirement. What they proposed would have given them complete control over our housing situation. They could have evicted us, sold the property, or used it as collateral for their own debts.
I pointed to specific clauses in the trust agreement. We would have been tenants in our own home, dependent on their goodwill for basic shelter. The color drained from her face as she realized the implications of what she'd supported. I didn't know. They said it was just a formality, that nothing would really change except we wouldn't have mortgage payments. They lied to you, Sarah. They manipulated you into helping them steal from us because they thought I was just a construction worker with no other options. I leaned back in my chair, watching her process the scope of her parents' deception. But here's what they don't know yet. I pulled out another set of documents, property records showing ownership of the house on Maple Street where her parents lived. They've been my tenants for 3 years. I'm their landlord, and I've been subsidizing their rent by $200 a month out of family loyalty. Sarah stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. You own their house. I own their house. I've been helping them financially for years without them knowing it, while they planned to pressure me into giving up everything I've worked for. I felt a cold satisfaction watching her realize the full scope of the situation. They're not struggling because of medical bills or property taxes. They're struggling because they've been living beyond their means while taking my charity for granted. Oh my God. She put her head in her hands, her voice muffled and broken. What have we done? You chose your parents over your husband. They chose greed over family loyalty. I chose to protect myself and our future instead of being victimized by people who thought I was weak. I gathered up the documents, organizing them back into neat stacks. The question now is what happens next? Sarah looked up at me with tears in her eyes, mascara smudged and her composure completely shattered. What do you mean?
I mean your parents are about to get a rent increase notice that brings their monthly payment up to market rates. I mean I've consulted with a lawyer about protecting our assets from any future attempts at manipulation or coercion. I mean the naive construction worker they thought they could push around doesn't exist anymore. Marcus, please, can't we work this out as a family? Can't we find a way to help them without destroying everything? I looked at my wife, at the woman I'd loved and protected and apparently failed to trust with the truth about our lives, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Sarah, they threatened to make you choose between them and me. They came into our home with legal documents designed to steal our property. They used your love for them as a weapon against our marriage. What exactly is there to work out? She was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking with the weight of realization and regret. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I didn't understand what they were really asking for. I thought we were helping family. Family doesn't threaten family. Family doesn't manipulate and lie and scheme to take what doesn't belong to them. I stood up feeling older and colder than I had that morning. Your parents aren't family, Sarah. They're strangers who happen to share your DNA and have spent years convincing you that their needs matter more than our marriage. What are you going to do? I looked around the dining room, at the crown molding I'd installed and the hardwood floors I'd refinished and the light fixture I'd hung with such care and pride. I'm going to protect what I've built. I'm going to make sure that people who try to take advantage of my kindness learn that kindness has limits, and I'm going to decide whether our marriage is worth saving or if it's just another asset that needs to be protected from people who don't appreciate its value. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and broken trust. Sarah sat at the table surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built without her knowledge, while I stood looking down at the woman who'd agreed to help her parents steal from us because she thought we had nothing left to lose. Outside, the evening light was fading into darkness, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic as people made their way home to families and relationships that maybe made more sense than ours did. Inside, we sat in the ruins of whatever trust and partnership we'd thought we were building together, trying to figure out if there was anything left worth salvaging. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agnes Pemberton, confirming our meeting the next morning to finalize the duplex another property, another investment, another step toward the kind of financial independence that would make other people's schemes and manipulations irrelevant to my life. I looked at Sarah one more time, memorizing her face in case this was the last conversation we'd have as husband and wife. Your parents have 48 hours to decide if they want to pay market rate rent or find somewhere else to live. You have the same amount of time to decide if you want to be married to me or to them. Marcus, please don't make me choose. I'm not making you choose, Sarah. You already chose. I'm just making sure you understand what that choice is going to cost. I left her sitting at the table with the documents spread in front of her, evidence of the life we could have had if trust and honesty had mattered more than family politics and financial manipulation. Upstairs, I packed a bag with enough clothes for several days, along with the legal documents James had prepared for asset protection. The hotel room I checked into that night was clean and anonymous, the kind of temporary space that business travelers used when they needed to be somewhere other than home. I sat by the window looking out at the city lights, thinking about the conversation with Sarah and the phone calls I would need to make in the morning. First, I would call Karen Hendricks and authorize the rent increase notice for Harold and Linda. Then I would meet with Agnes Pemberton and close on the duplex that would be my 9th rental property. After that, I would call James Rodriguez and implement the aggressive asset protection strategy that would shield my investments from any future family schemes. But tonight I just sat in the darkness and tried to remember what it felt like to believe that love and loyalty were enough to build a life on. Tried to recall the feeling of trusting that the people closest to you wanted what was best for you instead of what was best for them. Outside my hotel window, the city went about its business, people living their lives and making their choices without knowing or caring about the quiet war that was beginning in the suburbs. Some of them were probably dealing with their own family conflicts, their own betrayals and disappointments and broken trust, but none of them were learning that their in-laws had been living in their house for 3 years while planning to steal their home. None of them were discovering that their spouse had agreed to help with the theft because she thought it was just family helping family. I turned off the lights and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring consequences that would reshape every relationship in my life. The naive construction worker who'd married for love and trusted his wife to choose him over her parents' greed was gone forever. In his place was someone harder and smarter, someone who understood that kindness without boundaries was just weakness by another name, and that sometimes the only way to protect what you'd built was to show people exactly what they stood to lose when they mistook generosity for stupidity. The war was about to begin, and I intended to win it. The phone call came at 7:15 in the morning, 2 days after I'd given Sarah and her parents their ultimatum. I was sitting in my hotel room reviewing the final paperwork for the duplex purchase when Harold's number appeared on my screen. His voice was different when I answered, strained and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "Marcus, we need to talk," he said without any of his usual false warmth. "Can you meet us at the house this morning?" "Which house would that be, Harold?" I kept my voice neutral, though I could feel satisfaction building in my chest. "Mine or yours?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his tone was carefully controlled. "You know, don't you? I know a lot of things. You'll need to be more specific. About the rental property. About us being your tenants." Another pause. "How long have you known?" I looked out the hotel window at the morning traffic, people starting their day without knowing that their quiet neighbor was about to end a 3-year deception that had funded their comfortable retirement. "I've always known, Harold. I bought the house specifically because you and Linda needed a place to live after you sold your previous home. I kept the rent low because I thought we were family." The admission hit him like a physical blow. I could hear him breathing heavily, probably trying to process the implications of what I'd just told him. "You've been our landlord for 3 years, and you never said anything." "I kept it private because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. I wanted you to have dignity and independence while I helped you financially." I paused, letting the weight of his ingratitude settle between us. "Of course that was before you decided to try stealing my house. Marcus, listen. We can work this out. Linda and we made a mistake. We were desperate, and we thought." His voice trailed off as he realized there was no way to finish that sentence without admitting to attempted theft. "You thought what, Harold? That I was weak enough to give up everything I'd worked for? That your daughter would choose your greed over our marriage? That there would be no consequences for threatening and manipulating your way into taking what didn't belong to you?" When I arrived at my house an hour later, 3 cars were parked in the driveway. Harold and Linda's Buick, Sarah's Honda, and a silver Mercedes that I didn't recognize. Through the front window I could see people gathered around the dining room table where this whole confrontation had started 3 days earlier. Sarah met me at the door, her eyes red from crying but her expression determined. "Marcus, thank you for coming. Mom and Dad brought someone with them, a mediator who specializes in family financial disputes. They want to find a solution that works for everyone." The mediator was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed and carrying the kind of leather portfolio that expensive consultants use to justify their fees. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Wells and explained that she'd been hired to help facilitate a conversation about complex family financial dynamics and mutually beneficial resolutions. Harold and Linda sat at one end of the table, looking smaller and older than they had when they'd been making demands about my property. The swagger and confidence they'd shown when they thought they were dealing with a powerless son-in-law had evaporated, replaced by the nervous energy of people who just realized they'd been playing a game where they didn't understand the rules. "Marcus," Dr. Wells began, her voice trained in the kind of calm authority that was supposed to make everyone feel heard and validated. "I understand there's been some tension around family financial responsibilities and property ownership. Harold and Linda have asked me to help explore options that might address their concerns while respecting your boundaries." I took the seat across from Harold, the same position I'd been in when he tried to steal my house.
Let me save everyone some time. There are no options to explore. Harold and Linda attempted to coerce me into transferring ownership of my primary residence through emotional manipulation and threats to my marriage. That's not a family financial dispute. That's attempted theft. Dr. Wells made notes on her legal pad, nodding in the way that mediators do when they're trying to remain neutral. "I can hear that you feel violated by their approach. At the same time, it sounds like there may have been miscommunication about financial resources and family support expectations." There was no miscommunication. They knew exactly what they were asking for and exactly how they were planning to get it. I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app I'd been using to document conversations since this started. "Would you like to hear Harold threatening to destroy my marriage if I didn't comply with his demands?" The color drained from Harold's face. "You recorded our conversations. I documented everything, Harold. Every threat,
every manipulation, every lie you told your daughter to get her to participate in your scheme. I looked at Dr. Wells, whose professional composure was beginning to crack. Are you aware that your clients were living in property I own while planning to steal my home? Did they mention that detail when they hired you? Linda spoke for the first time since I'd arrived, her voice small and defensive. We didn't know you owned the rental house. We thought you were just a construction worker who'd gotten lucky with one property. You thought I was weak and stupid, so you decided to take advantage of that. I turned to Sarah, who was staring at her hands like they held the answers to questions she was afraid to ask. And you helped them because you thought the same thing. Dr. Wells cleared her throat, trying to regain control of a mediation that was rapidly becoming an interrogation. Marcus, I understand you're angry, but perhaps we can focus on moving forward rather than relitigating past misunderstandings. Moving forward is exactly what I'm doing. I pulled out the rental agreement documents that Karen had prepared. Harold and Linda, you have a choice. You can pay market rate rent of $1,200 a month starting next week, or you can find somewhere else to live. Those are your options. Harold's face went through several expressions as he processed what I was telling him. $1,200, we can't afford $1,200 a month. That's why we needed help with housing costs. Then you should have asked for help instead of trying to steal my house. I slid the documents across the table to him. You've been paying $850 for 3 years because I was subsidizing your rent out of family loyalty. That loyalty ended when you threatened my marriage. Linda was crying now, the kind of desperate tears that came when someone realized their comfortable assumptions about the world were completely wrong. Marcus, please, we're sorry, we made a terrible mistake, but we're family. Surely we can work something out. Family doesn't threaten family. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and scheme to take what doesn't belong to them. I stood up, feeling the weight of 3 years of hidden generosity and recent betrayal settling into cold determination. You had 3 years of below-market rent that saved you almost $7,000. You had a son-in-law who helped you financially without asking for gratitude or recognition. You had a daughter who loved you enough to nearly destroy her mentor for your benefit. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had fundamentally or mentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. What you had was enough, but you wanted more, and you were willing to steal to get it. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. Dr. Wells was writing furiously, probably trying to document a mediation that had become something entirely different from what she'd been hired to facilitate. Marcus, I think what Harold and Linda are trying to express is that they recognize their approach was inappropriate, and they're hoping to find a way to repair the relationship while addressing their genuine financial concerns. Their financial concerns are not my responsibility. Their relationship with their daughter is not my problem to solve. Their housing situation is not my obligation to subsidize. I gathered up my documents, preparing to leave people who'd proven they didn't deserve my time or consideration. The only relationship I'm interested in repairing is my marriage, and that depends entirely on whether Sarah chooses to be married to me or to her parents. Sarah looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Marcus, I choose you. I chose wrong before, but I'm choosing you now. Please don't give up on us. Choosing me means accepting that your parents are no longer welcome in our lives until they demonstrate genuine remorse and behavioral change. It means supporting my decision to protect our assets from people who've proven they can't be trusted. It means putting our marriage ahead of their manipulation. I moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. It means letting them face the consequences of their choices without rushing to rescue them from problems they created for themselves. Harold stood up, his face flushed with anger and desperation. You can't just cut us off. We're Sarah's parents. We raised her, we supported her, we deserve better than this. You deserve exactly what you've earned through your actions. Nothing more, nothing less. I looked at him one final time, memorizing the face of a man who'd tried to steal my life and failed. You have until the end of the month to decide about the rent increase. After that, I'll assume you're choosing to move and I'll start eviction proceedings. Dr. Wells followed me toward the door, probably hoping to salvage something from a mediation that had exposed her clients as attempted thieves rather than misunderstood family members. Marcus, I hope you'll reconsider the possibility of ongoing family counseling. These situations often look different with time and professional guidance. Dr. Wells, they hired you under false pretenses. They told you this was a family financial dispute when it was actually attempted theft through emotional manipulation. If you're interested in professional guidance, you might want to advise them to consult with a criminal attorney about the legal implications of property fraud. Outside, the morning air felt cleaner somehow, like I'd walked out of a room full of smoke and into clear sunlight. My phone was already buzzing with text messages from Sarah, probably trying to continue conversations that I wasn't ready to have. The hard part was over, the truth was out, the boundaries were set, and the consequences were beginning. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my newly purchased duplex, reviewing rental applications from potential tenants for the second unit. Harold and Linda had chosen to move rather than pay market rent, finding a smaller apartment across town that fit their actual budget. They'd sent several messages through Sarah asking for reconciliation meetings and second chances, but I'd made it clear that contact would only be possible after they demonstrated genuine understanding of what they'd done wrong. Sarah and I were in counseling, working through the trust issues that came from years of financial secrecy on my part and recent betrayal on hers. It was slow, difficult work that required both of us to acknowledge ways we'd failed each other and make commitments to better communication going forward. Some days it felt like we were rebuilding our marriage from scratch, but other days I could see glimpses of the partnership we might become if we both stayed committed to honesty and transparency. The property management company had found new tenants for the house on Maple Street, a young couple with stable jobs who paid their rent on time and understood that below-market rates were earned through good behavior rather than family connections. The rental income from all 9 properties was approaching the point where I could transition away from construction work entirely, focusing instead on expanding the portfolio and managing investments. But the most important change was internal. The naive man who'd believed that kindness and hard work would automatically be rewarded with loyalty and respect was gone, replaced by someone who understood that boundaries weren't barriers to relationships but foundations for healthy ones. People who truly cared about you wanted you to protect yourself and your interests, not sacrifice them for their convenience. My phone rang as I was finishing the tenant applications. James Rodriguez, calling with updates about the legal protections we'd put in place around my assets. Marcus, I wanted to let you know that the LLC structures are all finalized, and your properties are protected from any future claims or manipulation attempts, he said. Also, I've been contacted by an attorney representing your former in-laws. They're asking about the possibility of legal action related to the rental situation. I leaned back in my chair, feeling calm rather than anxious about the prospect of continued conflict. What kind of legal action? They're claiming that your failure to disclose the landlord relationship constituted fraud, and that the rent increase was retaliatory. It's a weak case built on hurt feelings rather than actual legal violations, but they seem determined to pursue it. Let them pursue it. They'll discover that documenting their attempted theft of my property makes for an interesting counter-narrative. I looked out the window at the duplex's small backyard, where the previous owners had planted fruit trees that were just beginning to show spring buds. James, sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. If they want to continue this fight in court, they'll learn exactly how expensive it gets to make accusations you can't prove. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my new investment property, thinking about the choices that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I'd been a man who kept his success secret to avoid stress and conflict, who subsidized his in-laws' lifestyle out of misplaced loyalty, who believed that love meant never having to set boundaries with family. Now I was someone who understood that real love required honest communication, that genuine family relationships were built on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice, and that protecting what you'd built wasn't selfishness but responsibility. The lesson hadn't been easy for anyone involved. Harold and Linda had learned that manipulation and threats had consequences they weren't prepared to face. Sarah had learned that choosing sides in family conflicts meant accepting responsibility for the outcomes of those choices. I had learned that kindness without boundaries was just another form of self-destruction. But the most important lesson was one that would serve me for the rest of my life. When people show you who they really are through their actions rather than their words, believe them the first time. And when people try to take what doesn't belong to them, don't make it easy by pretending it's something other than theft. The war was over, and I had won it not through cruelty or revenge, but by simply refusing to be a victim of people who mistook my kindness for weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show people exactly what they stand to lose when they choose greed over gratitude, manipulation over honesty, and exploitation over relationship. In the end, ownership isn't just about property, or assets or financial success. It's about owning your choices, owning your boundaries, and owning the consequences of both. Harold and Linda had wanted to own my house without earning it. Instead, they'd learned what it meant to own the results of their character, and that turned out to be a much more expensive lesson than they'd bargained for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.